You were never stuck. You were trained. Somewhere along the way, someone handed you a smaller life and told you it was realistic, and you believed them. And that belief became the ceiling you now call your limit. Nobody sat you down and announced it. Nobody handed you a document to sign. It happened quietly, in 1,000 small moments, 1,000 tiny corrections from well-meaning people who had already accepted their own ceiling and needed you to accept yours too, until the small thinking stopped sounding like their voice and started sounding like your own. You forgot it was ever installed. You started calling it common sense. And tonight, for the next 30 minutes, we are going to find that program, look at it directly under the light, and shut it off piece by piece for good. Maybe you already sense it. Maybe you felt it for years, this strange, aching gap between what you quietly know you're capable of and what you actually do with your days. Perhaps right now, you're lying in bed with the volume low, scrolling past people who seem to be living the exact life you keep postponing. And some part of you whispers, "That could be me," while another part, older and louder and far more practiced, answers back immediately, "Not you, not this life, not now, maybe never." Maybe you work hard, harder than most people around you even realize, staying later than you have to, saying yes when your body is begging you to say no, and still you watch the finish line move a little further away every single time you get close enough to touch it. Perhaps you've started over more times than you'd ever admit out loud to another human being. A new plan every January, a new routine after a hard week that finally broke something loose in you. A new promise to yourself at 2 in the morning, made with total sincerity, gone completely by Wednesday afternoon. And maybe the cruelest part isn't even the failing itself. It's the specific, private exhaustion of trying to convince yourself one more time that this attempt will finally be different, while a quiet voice underneath keeps whispering that you already know exactly how this one ends too. Maybe you've gotten good at hiding it too, good at answering "I'm fine" with the right amount of ease in your voice. Good at showing up to work looking like someone who has it together, while privately keeping a running tally of every version of yourself you were supposed to have become by now. Maybe you compare your unfinished chapters to everyone else's highlight reel and walk away feeling like the only person still figuring it out, when the truth is almost everyone around you is quietly doing the exact same thing, running the exact same comparison, losing the exact same argument with themselves late at night. You are not uniquely behind. You just haven't been shown, until now, that behind was never the correct word for what's actually happening inside you. If that's you, and I suspect it is, at least some of it, I want you to hear something clearly before we go any further, because everything else in this video depends on you actually believing this part first. None of that means you're broken. It doesn't mean you're lazy or undisciplined or somehow missing whatever mysterious ingredient other people were born with. It means your mind has simply been running old instructions, instructions you never consciously chose and were never taught how to examine, let alone rewrite. Nearly a century ago, a man named Napoleon Hill spent more than 20 years studying the most successful people of his era, men who built entire empires out of nothing but raw will and a working mind. And he found something almost every single one of them had in common, something that had nothing to do with luck, nothing to do with privilege, nothing to do with being born into the right family at the right time. It was the way they used their own minds, deliberately, as a tool they operated instead of a passenger seat they simply rode around in. And what he discovered still works today, exactly as it worked then, because the human mind hasn't fundamentally changed in 100 years. Only the excuses have gotten more sophisticated. Here's what I mean by that specifically. 100 years ago, the excuse might have sounded like, "I wasn't born into the right family." Today it sounds like, "The algorithm doesn't favor people like me," or "I missed the window," or "Everyone already got there first." Different costume, same underlying program, still whispering the same core message it has always whispered, which is simply this: don't bother trying, because trying is for people who were built differently than you. That message was never true for Carnegie's generation, and it isn't true for yours either. It just found a more modern outfit to wear. Let's start with the thing almost everyone gets wrong from the very beginning, because it quietly poisons everything that comes after it. Most people believe that setting a big, specific goal is dangerous, that dreaming too precisely just sets you up for a harder fall, so they keep their ambitions soft and vague on purpose. a general fog of wanting more without ever actually naming what more looks like. Vague is safer, they think. Vague can't disappoint you the way a specific target can. But Hill proved the exact opposite, and the evidence he gathered was overwhelming. Vague wanting is precisely what keeps people stuck in place for years, sometimes decades, because a mind without a defined target has nothing concrete to organize itself around, nothing to filter decisions through, nothing to say yes and no to. He called this definiteness of purpose, and it might be the single most foundational shift a person can make, because a goal you cannot clearly describe out loud is a goal your subconscious mind cannot clearly pursue in the background while you sleep, while you work, while you go about your ordinary Tuesday. Think for a moment about Andrew Carnegie, a boy who arrived in America with essentially nothing, working long hours in a cotton mill for a few cents a day in conditions that would have convinced most people their circumstances had already decided their future for them. What separated Carnegie from 1,000 other boys living through nearly identical circumstances wasn't raw talent, and it wasn't some hidden advantage nobody else had access to. It was that somewhere early on, he decided, with a clarity most people reserve only for their fears, exactly the scale and shape of the impact he intended to build. He didn't wander toward success, hoping to eventually stumble into it. He named it. He refined the picture again and again as he grew. And then he organized every single decision, every risk, every relationship around that specific, unmistakable target, year after year, decade after decade, until the entire steel industry had to reorganize itself around him instead of the other way around. That is the actual power of a defined target. It doesn't guarantee comfort along the way. It never did, not for him and not for anyone else. What it guarantees is direction, and direction is the one thing a foggy dream can never provide. Here's your action step, and I want you to actually do this. Not just nod along and keep scrolling. Tonight before you sleep, write down one specific outcome you're chasing over the next 12 months in a single clear sentence, with a real number or a real date attached to it wherever possible. Not "I want to be successful," not "I want things to get better." Something you could hand to a complete stranger and have them understand precisely what you're aiming at, with no follow-up questions needed. Specificity is the doorway. Vague dreams never open it, no matter how sincerely you believe in them. And notice something here, because it matters more than it sounds like it does. Writing that sentence down doesn't feel like much in the moment. It feels almost too small to count as progress, especially compared to the size of the life you're actually trying to build. But that's exactly the trap the small program wants you to fall into, the idea that only dramatic gestures count as real change. Carnegie's entire empire started as a picture in the mind of a boy sweeping floors in a cotton mill, a picture nobody else could see and nobody else was asked to approve. The size of the first step was never the point. The clarity of the target was. Now, once you actually know what you're aiming at, the very next battle happens entirely inside your own head, in the quiet words you say to yourself when nobody else is listening, in the running commentary that plays underneath every decision you make all day long. Hill called this autosuggestion, the principle that your subconscious mind absorbs whatever you feed it repeatedly, whether that input happens to be true or not, whether it's actually helping you or slowly, quietly sabotaging you from the inside. This is the part most people skip past because it sounds soft, almost too simple to matter next to talk of empires and fortunes. But consider this carefully for a moment. You are already practicing autosuggestion right now, every single day, just unconsciously, and usually in exactly the wrong direction. Every time you catch yourself thinking, "I always mess this up," or "that's just not how things work out for someone like me," you are not accurately describing reality. You are training it, one repetition at a time, the same way a muscle gets trained, the same way a habit gets carved into a schedule until it stops feeling optional. Henry Ford understood this better than almost anyone of his generation, and he proved it in a very practical, unglamorous way. When he set out to build a lightweight, affordable V8 engine cast in a single block, his own engineers told him, with total confidence, that it simply couldn't be done, that the physics and the manufacturing limits of the era wouldn't allow it. Ford didn't sit down and argue the physics with them. He simply told them to keep working until they found a way anyway, because in his mind, the belief always came first, and the method was expected to follow it, eventually, stubbornly, however long that took. And it did follow. His engineers built it. Ford is remembered, in different phrasings passed down over the decades, for the essential idea that whether a person believes they can accomplish something or believes they cannot, they are almost always right, because the belief itself quietly shapes how much real effort a person is even willing to give the attempt. Here is your action step. For the next 7 days, every single morning before you touch your phone, say your goal out loud to yourself as though it is already becoming true, using present tense language instead of someday language. Not, I hope to build this eventually. Instead, I am building this right now, today. It will feel strange the first few mornings, maybe even a little foolish standing there talking to an empty room. Let it feel foolish. Foolish and effective have never actually been opposites. Here's the myth most people carry around without ever questioning it, the one that quietly undermines this entire principle before they've even tried it. Most people believe that self-talk is just noise, a harmless private habit with no real consequence, something that happens after the real work of a day rather than underneath it. But Hill proved that the relationship actually runs the other direction. The words you repeat to yourself aren't a reflection of your circumstances. They are frequently the cause of them, because the subconscious mind doesn't distinguish between a fact and a frequently repeated statement. It simply absorbs whichever one shows up most often, and then quietly arranges your effort, your posture, your willingness to take risks around whatever it has absorbed. That is not a small mechanism. That is the whole engine running underneath everything else in this video. Now let's talk about the exact moment where most people quietly give up, even though they would never admit out loud that giving up is what actually happened. They call it being realistic instead. They call it moving on, growing up, focusing on what matters. But underneath all of that language, it is simply a loss of faith. Not faith in some vague cosmic sense, but faith in the specific stubborn belief that the goal is still reachable even when the evidence directly in front of you seems to be arguing otherwise. Hill considered faith one of the most misunderstood forces in human achievement because people constantly confuse it with blind optimism, when really it functions much closer to a decision to keep operating, as if the outcome remains possible for exactly long enough for it to actually become possible. There may be no better example of this anywhere in that entire era than Thomas Edison and his pursuit of a working incandescent light bulb. By the time he finally succeeded, Edison had worked his way through thousands of failed attempts, materials that scorched and cracked, filaments that glowed for a few seconds and then burned out completely, configurations that led absolutely nowhere useful. A young reporter once asked him how it felt to fail so many times in a row, and Edison's answer has echoed through more than a century of retelling in slightly different words each time. The essential idea being that he hadn't actually failed at all. He had simply discovered thousands of specific ways that would not work, which meant, by his own accounting, that he was getting measurably closer with every single attempt, not further away from it. That reframe, that deliberate choice to interpret failure as information instead of verdict, is faith in its most practical, unglamorous form. It isn't about pretending the setback didn't sting. It's about refusing to let the setback have the final word on what happens next. Here is your action step. Take the last thing you quietly gave up on, the goal you tucked away in a drawer somewhere and stopped mentioning because it had started to feel embarrassing to still be chasing it. Write down 3 specific, honest reasons it didn't work the first time, not as self-punishment, but purely as information, the same clinical way Edison cataloged a burnt-out filament before reaching for the next one. Then write 1 sentence describing exactly what you would do differently now that you know those 3 things. That is faith with its sleeves actually rolled up, doing real work instead of just sounding nice in a quote. Notice that faith, in this sense, never asked Edison to feel certain. It only asked him to keep acting as though the outcome remained possible. 1 more day, 1 more filament, 1 more configuration. That distinction matters enormously because so many people wait for the feeling of certainty to arrive before they'll allow themselves to keep going. And that feeling almost never arrives on schedule, if it arrives at all. You are not waiting to feel ready. You are simply deciding to keep moving before the readiness shows up and letting the readiness catch up to you later, the way it eventually caught up to every single person we've talked about tonight. Let's pause here for a moment because I want to name something most motivational content quietly skips over entirely. None of these principles work in isolation, floating around loose in your head, disconnected from your actual ordinary days. They need structure, they need a container to live inside, or they evaporate by Thursday afternoon the exact same way every New Year's resolution you've ever made eventually did. This is where Hill's principle of organized planning enters the picture, and it is the part that quietly separates people who dream vividly from people who actually finish building something real. John D. Rockefeller, arguably the most methodical businessman of his entire era, didn't build Standard Oil through inspiration alone, and he would have told you so directly if you'd asked him. He built it through relentless, almost obsessive systemization, breaking enormous, sprawling ambitions down into precise, repeatable processes, refining each one over and over until waste disappeared and efficiency became second nature to everyone around him. Where other oil producers of the time operated largely on instinct and momentum, chasing whatever opportunity looked shiniest that week, Rockefeller operated on structure, careful documentation, and relentless refinement of the boring middle steps nobody else wanted to bother with. And structure compounds in a way raw enthusiasm simply never can. People love to romanticize the big dramatic dream. Rockefeller understood earlier and more completely than almost anyone around him that the boring architecture underneath the dream is what actually determines whether it survives contact with reality, month after unglamorous month. Here is your action step. Take that 12-month goal you wrote down earlier tonight and break it into 4 smaller checkpoints, one every 3 months, each one with its own clear, unmistakable marker of progress attached to it. Don't overcomplicate this. Make it specific enough that you will know, without any guessing or generous self-interpretation, whether you actually hit it or genuinely missed it. A goal without checkpoints is just a wish wearing a slightly nicer outfit. There's a reason this principle gets skipped so often in favor of the flashier ones. Planning doesn't feel like transformation while you're doing it. It feels like paperwork, like the unglamorous cousin of the real dream. But think about what Rockefeller was actually doing underneath all that structure. He wasn't organizing spreadsheets for their own sake. He was building a container strong enough to hold an ambition that size without it collapsing under its own weight the first time reality pushed back. Your dream deserves that same container. It has earned it. Don't leave it sitting out in the open with nothing holding its shape. And now we arrive at the principle that quietly ties every single one of the others together, the one that ultimately determines whether any of this survives contact with a hard week, a brutal month, a long stretch of closed doors that seem to be sending you a very clear message: persistence. Hill studied hundreds of people who reached genuinely extraordinary heights over the course of his research, and he found almost no exceptions to this particular pattern, no matter which industry or era he looked at. Talent didn't separate the ones who made it from everyone else. Intelligence didn't reliably separate them either. What separated them was a willingness to keep functioning, keep working, keep quietly showing up, specifically during the exact stretch where quitting would have looked completely reasonable to absolutely everyone watching from the outside. Henry Ford, long before the world knew his name the way it does now, went bankrupt not once, but twice, in 2 separate companies, 2 separate collapses, 2 separate moments where any rational observer standing nearby would have told him plainly that the automobile business simply wasn't meant for him. Most people, after failing publicly at the same ambition twice in a row, quietly rebrand themselves as someone who tried something else instead, and nobody would even blame them for it. Ford didn't take that exit. He treated each collapse as tuition rather than a final verdict on his ability. And by the time he founded the company that would eventually bear his name and reshape an entire century of transportation, he had already absorbed every hard lesson those 2 failures had to offer him. The persistence wasn't loud, and it wasn't dramatic in the moment. It was simply refusal, repeated quietly day after unremarkable day, to accept the ending that the previous two failures kept trying to write for him. Here is your action step. Choose one specific moment coming up this week where you know you will feel the pull to quit something that genuinely matters to you, and decide right now, in advance, before that moment even arrives, that you will take exactly one more concrete action on it anyway, before you allow yourself to reconsider anything. Not forever, just one more action. Persistence was never a fixed personality trait that some lucky people happen to have and others simply don't. It is a decision made repeatedly in small and unglamorous increments, usually during the exact moments when no one else is watching closely enough to notice. Ask yourself honestly, how many times in your own life has the breakthrough actually arrived right after you were ready to quit? Not months before, but disturbingly close to the moment you nearly walked away. Most people never find out because they walk away just a little too early, right before the door was about to open. Ford didn't know his third company would be the one that worked. Edison didn't know which attempt would finally hold. Neither of them was operating on certainty. They were operating on refusal, and refusal doesn't require you to know the ending in advance. It only requires you to keep showing up until you do. And maybe that's the real reason persistence gets romanticized so heavily after the fact, and so rarely respected while it's actually happening. From the outside, the version that works looks inevitable, almost obvious in hindsight, as if success was always going to arrive eventually. From the inside, in the actual middle of it, there is no such certainty available anywhere. There is only the next attempt and the decision, made again and again, to take it anyway. Now, I want to step out of the teaching for a moment and talk to you plainly, the way I'd talk to someone sitting across from me at a kitchen table at midnight, because I don't think honesty and instruction have to live in separate rooms of the same house. I know what it's like to hear principles like these laid out so cleanly and think that sounds good for someone else, someone with more time, more resources, a cleaner starting point than mine. I know the specific fatigue of hearing "believe in yourself" from people who never had to claw their way out of anything real. So let me be clear about what I'm actually asking of you here, because it was never blind positivity and it was never meant to be a phrase printed on a mug. What I'm asking is smaller than that, and honestly harder than that too. I'm asking you to stop rehearsing the version of your life where nothing ever changes. That's the whole thing. Just stop rehearsing it tonight. You've told yourself that particular story so many times it has started to feel like memory instead of prediction. And it isn't memory at all. It's a script, quietly written a long time ago, and scripts can always be rewritten by the exact same hand that first wrote them. And I want to be honest with you about something else too, because it would be dishonest to end this without saying it. Rewriting that script doesn't feel triumphant most days. It rarely announces itself with music swelling in the background. Most days it looks like doing the small, unglamorous thing anyway, even though the old voice is still talking, even though the doubt hasn't fully left the room yet. Nobody tells you that part. They show you the finished empire, the famous name, the museum plaque, and they skip the years in between where the person doing the work still felt afraid most mornings and did the work anyway. That's not a footnote to the story. That is the actual story, the only version of it that was ever true. Courage was never the absence of fear. It was simply the decision to keep moving with the fear still sitting right there in the passenger seat, uninvited, along for the ride, whether it liked the destination or not. You were never behind. You were never too late, too old, too tired, or too far off track to matter anymore. You were simply operating on inherited instructions, absorbed so early and so quietly that you mistook them for your own honest conclusions about the world. And the extraordinary, almost unfair truth about the mind is that it doesn't actually care how many years the old program has been running. It only cares what you feed it starting right now, tonight, in this exact moment. That isn't a comforting platitude I'm handing you to feel better. It's closer to a mechanical fact about how belief and behavior actually interact underneath the surface. The same fact Carnegie quietly leaned on, the same fact Ford leaned on twice after two separate collapses, the same fact that kept Edison at his workbench through 10,000 versions of a failure that was never really failure at all, only information arriving one experiment at a time. So here's the one line I want you to leave with tonight, the one I want echoing in your head longer than anything else in this entire video. You are not behind. You were simply trained to think small, and training can always be undone by anyone willing to do the repetition required to undo it. Say that back to yourself right now if you need to hear it in your own voice. You are not behind. You were trained, and training can be undone. In the next 24 hours, I want you to do exactly one thing, nothing elaborate, nothing that requires a complete life overhaul by tomorrow afternoon, because overhauls collapse under their own weight, and you already know that from experience. Take the specific goal you wrote down tonight, the one with a real number or a real date attached to it, and take a single visible action toward it before you go to sleep tomorrow night. Send the email you've been drafting in your head for weeks. Make the call. Open the document you've been quietly avoiding every time you see it sitting there on your desktop. Not because one small action changes everything overnight, it won't, but because it proves something important to the part of your mind that has been running the small program for years without ever being challenged. It proves the program can be overwritten. And once that part of your mind actually knows that, really knows it, it starts looking for the next piece of evidence instead of reaching automatically for the next excuse. Think back to everything we walked through tonight. A defined target instead of a fog. Words that build instead of words that quietly erode. Faith that keeps moving without waiting for certainty to arrive first. A structure sturdy enough to hold the dream without it collapsing under its own weight. And underneath all of it, a refusal to accept the ending that fear keeps trying to write for you. None of these principles are complicated. None of them require permission from anyone else, a certain amount of money in the bank, or a more convenient starting point than the one you happen to be standing on right now. They only require repetition, the same repetition that quietly built the small program in the first place, now aimed in the opposite direction. If you're still with me right now, if something in this actually landed somewhere real, do one more thing before you close this out and go about the rest of your night. Down in the comments, write a single word, just one word, that represents exactly what you're committing to starting tonight. Not a paragraph explaining yourself, not a justification for anyone else reading it. One word. Let it be the very first small proof that the old story is already starting to lose its grip on you. Not because a single word in a comment section rewrites a life by itself, it won't. And I'm not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. But every single person we talked about tonight, Carnegie in that cotton mill, Ford after 2 collapses, Edison at his workbench somewhere past attempt number 9,000, Rockefeller building systems nobody else had the patience to build, every one of them started with a moment exactly this small. A decision made quietly, with no audience, no guarantee, and no proof yet that it would work. The size of tonight's decision was never the point. The direction was. You were never stuck. You were only ever waiting to find out exactly what you'd been trained to believe, so you could finally, deliberately, choose something else instead.